As I look around the room, there's faces that I recall seeing at the earliest ICEGOV in Macau, and faces of the new friends that I've met here today. And I want to, first of all, before we start this session, congratulate the ICEGOV 2019 organizing team, certainly the UNU-EGOV team that just walked in the room, Delphina and Luis. So wonderful to see so many people coming together again around the principles of the ICEGOV conference and how these principles have connected us all over these many years. So it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this keynote and panel session today. And as we get started, I want to first review the agenda because it's a little complicated. So we have two keynote speakers. First of all, we'll hear from John Lord from Huawei. And I never remember exactly, or can be sure that I've pronounced that correctly. So bear with me. We'll have a second keynote from Gemma van Halderen. And I'll talk a little bit more about those two wonderful presenters in a second. And then we'll have a plenary panel to follow up on the two keynotes, where our two panelists that you hadn't heard from up to that point, Boyega and Paul, will provide 5 minutes of thoughts and perspective to contribute to the conversation, and then we'll continue with an open Q&A. So we'll have a keynote, a Q&A, a keynote, a Q&A, short panel contributions, and then another open Q&A. And so our goal here today, the end of the first day, is to have as much interaction as possible. So I encourage you to prepare as we're listening to the remarks for questions. What are questions that you might like to ask of the speakers or the panelists? So our first presentation is from John Lord. John, if you'd like to join me here. His focus of his presentation is cyber diplomacy. So his title is A Time for Cyber Diplomacy. John will talk for, well, he had 25 minutes, but he tells me it's going to be 18 and no more. So we'll see. And then we'll have a chance to have one-on-one, if you will, one-on-one conversation with John before moving on to the second keynote. But before we begin, I'd like to just give you a chance to review, and I'll provide some highlights of John's bio. It's very, very impressive and very, very diverse. I was excited to read about all of the different kinds of things that he's been involved in, certainly with the Victorian government's Ministerial Community Advisory Committee in the Department of Justice. We love this kind of community engagement. 3 years as a chairman of the Victoria Veterans Council, and as, of course, you can read all the way through to the bottom, but I think about there are very few people in the world that I've met who've ever risen to the rank of Rear Admiral. And so thank you for your service, and thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you. We can move that on. Thank you. Thanks, Teresa.
There we go.
You have a bio like that either because you've been moved on very rapidly by your employers, or else you're getting old. So perhaps I have a mixture of both in those. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to participate in this fairly broad and wide-ranging conference that you've got over the next few days. I'm sure this morning you were welcomed to Melbourne, my home city at the moment. So once again, can I add to those welcomes? Welcome to Melbourne. I was talking earlier with some of the people who organised the conference, and it's very important you don't go to the glossy cities, Las Vegas, Gold Coast. It's more important you do go to cities where there's a serious attitude to them, and you've picked one of the best, or the best in Australia, in Melbourne. It is a centre for engineering, it's a centre of thought, and it's very much becoming a centre for our relationships into Asia. Now, one only has to read in the general media, not even the technical media these days, to understand that cybersecurity and its influence on the new emerging technologies are being cast as global issues right now, but also very much in the future. Now, I'll refer shortly that there's changes taking place that are making some of the major players and some of the larger countries in the world very uncomfortable with the changes going on. There does not appear to be a willingness yet amongst governments to discuss and develop global processes to deal with this changing environment in cybersecurity. But more, there's almost a move for protectionism, a reaction to say no immediately to maintain the status quo, rather than how. How can we integrate these new innovations and technologies into our societies? Thus, this conference, along with others I know many of you do attend, take on more importance at this time than perhaps ever before. Because if real experts in technology, academia, legislation and global protocols cannot come together and design processes and frameworks, then the practice of electronic governments, of which cybersecurity is a very important part, will remain in the domain of intelligence agencies, militaries and agenda-driven politicians. To not address a global governance framework for ICT governance, and particularly the aspect of cybersecurity, will see the growth and development we've worked very hard to achieve globally splutter. And this will impact on the efforts to raise the world's less off to a better living standard. Global coordination of infrastructure and technologies and the benefits of a growing global economy through global trade are absolutely essential for all of our futures. Now, Huawei is a private technology company, some of you may know, some of you may not, which prides itself on building high-quality, secure products for its customers. It's highly innovative, globally competitive and a technical pioneer. Through foresight, hard work and integrity, it's become the world's largest ICT infrastructure company end-to-end. Annually, it's in the top 5 of global patent applications, and it's in the top 5 companies all around the world in all industries in R&D expenditure. This year, our R&D expenditure was $15 billion US. Its products have helped over 170 different countries enjoy the mobile communications that we all now take for granted. It's been poked and prodded by nearly every national security agency worldwide, and there's never been any evidence of a security issue. In fact, Huawei has received many awards for its quality in security of its products and also in its overall protection of information. But somehow, Huawei has found itself in the middle of a technology war, with Australia banning the use of Huawei equipment in its future 5G networks and the United States of America endeavouring to collapse the company's global business. It's become embroiled in national security debates through inference and accusation rather than factual proof. And from this singular perspective that's being espoused, the West must reject Eastern technology and deny access to the East of Western technologies. But West versus East is pretty oversimplified. What is happening is that all countries are now being offered new innovation and technology from non-traditional countries of origin. For most of the past decades, leading technologies have really come from the United States and Europe. But now we are seeing an emergence of companies from China at the moment, but soon more from the rest of Asia, who are leading in areas of innovation and technology. Some traditionally minded countries are scrambling to accommodate with this inevitable change. A global technology war is being nurtured, and none of us can predict where that's going to end. One thing is clear, however, is that it will have a substantial impact on all nations, not only the protagonists. It's not just about 5G, it's a technology war that in the future could spread into all these new technologies: robots, artificial intelligence, smart cars, virtual reality, smart cities. These could all be added to the infrastructure which is considered under national security threats. Now, we live in a global world. Let's look at R&D and innovation. Chinese companies are now producing some of the world's best and lowest cost technologies, and so it's inevitable that manufacturers worldwide are using them as a source of their components, and businesses globally are purchasing Chinese products. Chinese companies leading in some technologies are really just the start. In 2015, 60% of the world's middle class were located in Europe and the United States. By 2025, 50%, and forecast by 2030, 60% of the world's middle class will be living in Asia. Not just China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the rest of Asia. Now, this will drive economic growth and education, which will feed the growth of more and more innovation, technological development, and ultimately leadership in many areas from Asia. The global community needs to recognise this, encourage it and manage it for the benefit of us all. Now, we live in a global world. Let's look at supply chains. In March 2012, a report published by the US Government Accountability Office examined the risks in the government's supply chain. The report identified that a simple laptop might contain components from 18 separate companies. Other reports on supply chain components have confirmed the global nature of technological products. If you look at Huawei itself, just a back-of-the-hand comparison, a broad rule of thumb for us is for Huawei's total componentry in all its products, about 30% comes from the US, about 30% from China, 22% from Taiwan, and 15% from Europe. But it's worth it, this globalisation, this diversification, because the benefits of global sourcing enable us to produce better products more economically. Closing the door on global technological sourcing just to mitigate a speculative risk is not going to last. It will have an effect on manufacturing. Many Western companies have outsourced their manufacturing to China, and repatriating it back will be a long, difficult and very expensive process. And we need to ask, do we really want to do that? Is that the best solution? Nationalism over globalism. Supply chains are global, trade is global, and we need to have global solutions for the future. Now, you may well be wondering what this has to do with your themes of the few days on electronic governance. Well, 24 months ago, I did too. Then there were a handful of global players endeavouring to be the absolute best at cybersecurity in their products, trying to provide their customers, which were companies, businesses, governments and utilities, with the best cybersecurity defences in their products and in their infrastructure. But then the debate started to change. A nationalistic theme emerged, where some of these leading global players were accused of being so good that they could engineer their products and damage national security. No discussion, no industry and government dialogue, but just a single shrill call of the dangers to a country's security. Of course, they really were misusing the term national security. They were alluding to specific areas of security, such as physical, supply, or data security. A nation needs always to be safe and secure, but it also needs to be prosperous. To have real national security, it also needs national power to be able to achieve its objectives. And a key part of national power is a nation's economy. And to be truly economically robust requires the optimal use of innovation and leading-edge technologies in the infrastructure, commerce and core of a country's structures. So by banning a leading player, in Australia's case Huawei, from participating in its 5G future, Australia has accepted the dual penalties of delays in implementing digital future and also substantially more cost. And furthermore, it's eroding global trade norms for overseas investment and trade. Now, there's no doubt the cyber environment contains many threats, and ICT infrastructure can be a key vulnerability. However, banning competition in technology is not the best way of addressing such infrastructure risks. The UK has decided it can mitigate some infrastructure risks through a Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre, a CSEC as it's called, to reduce risks through testing. Likewise, Germany has also addressed how it can manage the risk for infrastructure from companies with innovation and technology from those non-traditional sources. These are risk mitigation strategies, but they're not from all suppliers, so they only partially solve the problem. Countries need to consider perhaps that all equipment going into national infrastructure should be evaluated in a consistent manner, with a framework applicable to the whole of an industry. Now, this was the vision that 5 Western nations forming the group called Five Eyes, which you may have heard of, had when they established the Common Criteria Evaluation Scheme in the late 1990s. The scheme was designed as an international set of guidelines and specifications developed for evaluating information security products, specifically to ensure they met an agreed-upon security standard for government deployments. Australia has its own common criteria capability, the Australasian Information Security Evaluation Program, ICEP. We, Huawei, have enthusiastically adopted the common criteria scheme for key products. However, even with this recognised common criteria certification, we find ourselves unable to supply Australia's telecommunications infrastructure. Clearly, the common criteria is not working to achieve its intended outcome. Either the common criteria process needs to be revised or an alternative scheme needs to be established to replace it. Such a scheme needs to be driven by international standards, applied to all suppliers equally, and managed through a formal convention which is binding on all member countries. Now, Australia needs to be secure and prosperous. We need to build an effective cyber defence capability to contribute to our national security and our national economy. But we need to reprioritise our cyber activities and focus on developing the capability to mitigate supply chain risks and stop cyber breaches occurring. But enhancing our cyber security for critical infrastructure is not a single game of saying no, if unsure. We need to develop a framework where we embrace new innovation and technologies within a security assurance framework. We see the UK, Germany, Canada and other European countries doing this, and we too must find a practical way. Now, in closing, I proffer a three-step process, which just suggests how Australia might take a cyber diplomacy approach to Chinese and other countries' technologies, and through its example, set the pattern of behavioural norms in cyberspace. Firstly, Australia's cyber and international security engagement strategies are fine pieces of work and reflect a positive contribution by Australia in helping address some of the global cyberspace issues by using diplomacy. Let's see them come to life in an action plan that drives towards enabling a technological rich future, enabling all to have access to the latest advances in technology, irrespective of country of origin. Australia needs to redouble its efforts at the UN group of government experts on ICT and push harder to establish a globally acceptable law for cyberspace. Secondly, in 2017, Australia and China agreed not to conduct or support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, trade secrets or confidential business information. Again, through cyber diplomacy, Australia should build on this agreement to ensure it covers all aspects of cyber espionage and critical infrastructure attack. This will substantially reduce the risk facing Australia and enable us to shift from the current adversarial posture we have with China. If there are violations, they should be called and called out very loudly. But it's just plain wrong to have an agreement and then for both players to act outside of that agreement rather than trying to build trust within it. The International Cyber Engagement Strategy calls for establishing practical confidence-building measures to prevent conflict in cyberspace. We need these measures to be in place urgently, and so I would suggest that Australia take the lead in developing a mutual assurance scheme with China for monitoring this cyber activity. For Australia to do this would provide an example for the rest of the world and to do much to resolve the global risk of cyberspace. Now, thirdly, with respect to Australia also, it's been pleasing to see Australia establish the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on cybersecurity, which endeavours to bring government and industry together. However, this needs to be given real teeth, and real issues need to be discussed and advice given to government. This group was not consulted, not asked for any advice prior to the decision being made by the Australian government on its 5G future. The decision was made without government service providers, vendors and industry dialogue. It was a standalone government decision, and its effectiveness in the long term really does need to be questioned. Government cannot solve cybersecurity by legislation. It will continually fall behind the advances we have. Now, Australia is small in population, but it's a G20 member and it's a sophisticated and advanced economy. It needs to develop a more robust cyber assurance and defence capability if it is to maintain its national security, continue to grow its economy and be an effective participant in the global digital future. It can and should take the lead in using cyber diplomacy as a tool to allow access to all the new innovations and technological advancements and so reduce the threat to Australia in the future. In 2013 and 2018, I gave 2 nationally televised talks at the National Press Club in Canberra. And in those, I suggested that the only way cybersecurity is going to be successful for us in Australia, but also this reflects Huawei's position of a global cybersecurity, is for all parties to come together. Government, vendors, operators, and the broader industry working together to develop the best cybersecurity defences. It's not a matter of blocking, it's a matter of cooperation. Now, I guess in closing, talking of Australia's role, I can only say that such a global audience as you are, it is so important that the global environment follows a similar path to what I'm proposing for Australia. We need people like you at this conference who are the technical experts, the academic experts, legislative experts, who can drive such diplomacy and raise the conversation broadly around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You said that there'd never been any cybersecurity issues with Huawei. The National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK just released a report a few days ago that was pretty scathing. And it's sort of one of the things it said was you hadn't made any improvement after last year's report, which has also had a lot of issues. So, I mean, does that not vindicate the Australian government's decision to ban Huawei?
No.
Okay.
But no, just in fairness to you, I'll give a fuller answer. Yeah, you referred to the report, but you didn't list the 5 key points it made, which there were some engineering failures which had not been corrected. There were process failures that had not been corrected. The report clearly stated there were no security aspects of immediate concern to the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre, and it stressed that twice throughout the report. Yes, it was a report. It's a good wake-up call. This report is based on the CSEC cell that I referred to in my remarks. The CSEC cell tests most of our software and our equipment that goes into the UK network. And we have found it has been absolutely invaluable. And we're the only company that we think globally that gets it tested like that. Whenever faults have been found, the UK government testers and our people go back to Huawei, remedy the errors, and back comes the product again. This has been invaluable in improving our cybersecurity. And we would stand here today and say that the cooperation with the UK government has improved Huawei's cybersecurity of its products throughout the world. Yes, the last 2 reports, last year's report also had some, if you read that, also had failings in there. And these are very important. No vendor in the world makes completely cybersecurity products. And we will never achieve, all of us, even our competitors or us, will achieve 100% cybersecurity. But if you keep testing, you keep probing, you keep improving, as I said, everyone working together will eventually get the best defence we can get, which we need.
Could I just follow up just a couple of things?
You from the AFR?
Yeah, I'm from the AFR.
Yeah, I think you should announce that before you start.
Sorry, my mistake.
Thank you.
First of all, the failure to rectify last year's, it was pretty scathing about that. It said it completely failed to sort of do what needed to be done there. And the other one is, if other companies also had this kind of testing, do you think they would also have problems, the same sort of problems?
Yes, we would. I just explained. None of us can make absolutely perfect products. We all try, including our competitors. But there's always... You read daily, and if you do read widely, you'll know. Us and our competitors, quite often there's companies called out for finding backdoors or finding a hole in the software, and products recalled and repaired and put out. So it's a very common product. Yes, we had problems last year, we had a few problems the year before, and we work on them every time the report comes up. I think you need to be fair and say that overall, the UK overall said that they saw no security threat in the faults they'd found in that report. So thank you.
Other questions? We have a question over here. And if you could please identify yourself and maybe stand up so that folks in the rest of the room can see you. Thank you.
Bridget Luke from IBM, so I'm not from the AFR. I am interested, however, in outside of the political context in which obviously you're operating, It's very clear that there are questions around industry's motivations, and I really do feel that there needs to be at some stage a way in which we can transverse sort of that debate around motivations. And how do you foresee industry, government, citizens coming together and actually collaborating to make the most of the opportunities that we have ahead of us?
Yes, thanks, Bridget. It is the challenge, and I think that, in Australia, we're a small country, we yet have not got bodies that talk openly about these problems and how we're going to address them. Legislatively, we've brought in some frameworks which test products or say we won't have products from that country because of the security aspect in this bit of infrastructure. And I think all countries do that and should do that. There's always going to be critical infrastructure of national concern where you'll make your own rules. But at the end of the day, I think we do have to have these open forums and talk about how industry, government and its vendors and operators can actually present products and infrastructure that governments are comfortable with and within their security assurance framework. And it does involve security agencies having a huge part in that in government. It is an open conversation. We also, and I believe, testing is important. I was talking earlier to Randall from our digital office here in Australia. We need to have levels of security, not yes, no. I spent a long time in the military. You have, just quickly, 3 codes. First one was what we'd call an immediate code. It lasted an hour. After that, it didn't matter if someone found out what was in that encrypted bit of code because the information was stale. Then you had a day code, and then you had a long-term code. We need to classify our information, our data, our infrastructure to levels and apply different security protocols to each level. And that can easily be done if the vendor who's producing the infrastructure, the operator who's using it, and the government who describes the environment they want for different infrastructures come together. Now, those of you from other countries may have on your government's agendas bodies that do that. We in Australia don't yet have that.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So my name is Jem Van Hardren. I'm the Director of the Statistics Division at ESCAP. And I'm here to switch the conversation from cyber to data management and statistics. So I come from Thailand, so Swadika to all of those in the audience who are also from Thailand. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So just very briefly, ESCAP is a regional development arm of the United Nations. Our headquarters are in Bangkok, but we look after the capacity building and development needs of 58 member states, 53 member states, including Australia, and 9 associate members across our region. So we span as far to the west as Turkey. We include all of the Pacific Islands. To the south is New Zealand and as far north as the Russian Federation. But importantly, what we do is we provide development support to 2/3 of the world's populations that are located in our region. The ESCAP has a committee of statistics, and our vision is that by 2030, the end of the current development agenda, national statistical systems are enabled and empowered to lead the development of and deliver innovative, trusted and timely products and services that are urgently needed and evolving requirements for the 2030 agenda. And this is going to set the tone of my speech. So we've heard a few times today about the 2030 agenda, but what is it? It's actually a very ambitious development agenda. It has a timescale, 2015 to 2030. It coincides with the Paris Action Climate Change Agreement. It also coincides with some other international agreements like the Sendai Framework for Disasters. It covers these 17 goals here, and all of them are very ambitious. The prior development agenda focused very much on social goals, the Millennium Development Goals, but here you'll see we're also including economic. We're also including governance goals such as peace, justice and strong institutions. Now, how is the Pacific and Asia going in terms of these development goals? In ESCAP, we have developed, we just last week released a gateway that talked about two things: how much progress has been made since 2000 in regards to each of the goals, and how likely are we able to meet the targets by 2030. In terms of Asia and the Pacific, and I'm talking about these countries that are in the ESCAP region, if we're on target, how well are we going? We would meet that bar in the middle. So you see that we're actually not doing too well on very many of these goals. We're actually not on target for any of them. We're doing all right as a region on Goal 1, poverty, Goal 4 around quality education, Goal 7 on affordable and clean energy. But the red bars show that we're actually, based on our current data, going backwards in a couple of areas. We need to reverse trends in terms of clean water and sanitation, decent work, and responsible consumption and production. In terms of the second issue, though, how likely are we to meet the targets? This graph here, I just want you to look at the colours on here. So red, the green means that in terms of current progress, we're on we're okay on the trajectory. On the yellow colours, it's basically saying we need to pick up our game, we need to pick up the pace. On the red colours, we need to reverse current trends. But one I want to draw your attention to on this graph is the grey boxes. In Asia and the Pacific, we only have data to measure progress for about 35 or 6% of the indicators. So the grey boxes are the targets where we have no data to measure whether we're on track or not. So the Sustainable Development Goals, I see this as an opportunity, and this is what I want to bring to this conference, is that the Sustainable Development Goals highlight the need for new data and new partnerships, to expand the need for monitoring and development in many areas, to focus on disaggregation, and to use non-traditional data sources and methods. And all of this will require new partnerships. And our Deputy Secretary-General recently made this tweet. In 2015, 193 countries adopted this agenda. And then if you weave your way through, on Web 30, let's be clear, achieving the global goals depends on narrowing the digital gap. So what are some of these non-traditional data sources where we can use and countries in our region are currently using to address some of those data gaps in this 2030 agenda? And I'm just going to share with you now 4 examples from across our region. The first example I'm going to draw from is from here, from Australia. Australia has been using scanner data for its CPI for quite a number of years now. The CPI, or our measure of inflation, our consumer price index, the traditional way of collecting a consumer price index is to send people out into the field, into shops, into services, record the price, record the quantity of how much has been sold, and then compile it. It's a very resource-intensive process. But Australia now uses, for about 25% of its CPI, transaction data that comes from the supermarkets, when you scan your goods at the supermarkets. It's also increasingly using web scrape data. About 10% of the CPI is compiled using web scraped. Now, this was a very long process. Extensive consultation was undertaken with both the statistical and user community prior to implementing the change to use transaction and web scrape data. Very good quality benefits. We can now have a complete census, a complete enumeration of products that are used in the CPI, and we can get much higher quality because we do something methodologically called reweighting more frequently. But the cost benefits are fantastic. Instead of having a large field force having to collect the information, we now have a process that's less labour intensive, more frequent, more items and goods can be included in the CPI, and we have potential for innovation, in this case around spatial price indexes. So here's an example here in Australia, 25% using scanner data, 10% using web scrape data. This is the benefits of having this information digitally recorded. The second example I want to bring to is in our neighbours in Indonesia. There is a lot of interest in Asia and Pacific to make use of mobile phone data. In Indonesia, there are about 350 million active mobile phone numbers. All of them need to be registered, and these provide very good information on location-based services. I think there's about 18,000 islands in Indonesia. This is a very diverse part of our region. And what Indonesia is doing is looking to use mobile phone data, and they're not the only country in our region, for foreign, what they will call foreign tourists at cross-border posts. This is like migration information, domestic visitors, commuter estimation, and also event-based analysis. So event-based analysis is looking at where are our congestion spots. Like, I'm not sure if there was a congestion spot around RMIT this morning because of all of us here at this conference, but imagine if we were going to the Women's Football League on the weekend, 53,000 people coming into the centre of Melbourne. These are events where having some information around congestion is very valuable for the planning and analysis of services. So this is what Indonesia is doing. Afghanistan, this is a very, very exciting example. Afghanistan last held its population census in 1979. Population censuses are used for planning, they're used for distribution of taxation, they're used for how many people are in your parliament, they're used for a lot of local planning. Afghanistan last ran its census in 1979, so the government's been doing all of this planning based on estimates and projections for a very long time. Significant uncertainties in national and subnational estimates. Only 1/3 of the country was covered by a rolling, but there's some very real insecurity issues out there. So what they've done is they've explored the use of this geospatial data here, and I've just put some up here: number of compounds and areas settled, vegetation index, nighttime lights and slope. And what they've been able to do is combine this data with some very advanced methodological techniques to drive population estimates by age and sex for the regions within Afghanistan. Now, this has been rolled out with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, UKDOID, Flowminder, the UN, the Centre for International Earth Science Information Network, and a company called Grid3. But this is amazing stuff for the government of Afghanistan. It's a very hilly country, very insecure country, and they've been able to make use of this geospatial data to get much more accurate population estimates, much more timely population estimates. And the last example I'll give is from my own, from where I live, Thailand. And we've heard a lot about the SDGs is about leaving no one behind. And what we often have is we have data at the national level, or we have very aggregated data. But also you can combine this geospatial and big data to do disaggregation. So the fairly traditional way that statisticians like to do things is count things at the low level and aggregate up. But what we're seeing now is methodologists are getting aggregates, high level, and disaggregating. It's just a different way of working. And here's an example where we've got population census data on the top. We've then combined it with flood hazard and land cover data to get estimates of, on the right-hand side, down at the grid level, of population estimates for those small, very small areas in a place of Thailand. So this is a use of the big data for disaggregation. ESCAP is, the UN. I work in the development arm of the UN, and we're very much about building the skills and capacity and capability of people and countries. And we have two institutions, the Asia Pacific Centre for ICT that's based in South Korea, the Republic of Korea, and we have an institute called SIAP, the Statistical Institute for Asia Pacific. They're providing training not only in the use of big data for official statistics, but on the right-hand side there, they've recently released a new module called Realising Data-Driven Governance. So these tools, these training programs are available. So I'll now bring it back to Australia. I'm giving you a little bit of a highlight across our region. The Agenda 2030 is very exciting for me as a statistician because we have all these wonderful measurement opportunities. But as a country, the 2030 Agenda calls on countries to undertake something called a voluntary national review. Countries can decide when they do their VNRs and how they do it. And I've just brought up here Australia's voluntary national review from 2018. And then Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, to quote from this VNR, the VNR was used to share with the world the best of Australian innovation, ingenuity and partnership in building a stronger future. Australia is at the forefront of designing and utilising innovative solutions like big data to capture SDG relevant data, to assist with assessing performance and to assist in developing alternative or improved methodology. And one of the examples they shared in the voluntary national review, I recommend you go and have a look at it if you're interested in this, is a product called Digital Earth Australia. And it's an example, and to quote again from this VNR, it's an example of such innovation. It's led by Geoscience Australia. Digital Earth Australia translates decades of satellite data into information insights about Australia's land and oceans, and it can help measure and drive progress. It's underpinned by technology pioneered by Geoscience Australia, Australia's science organisation CSIRO, and by Australia's National Computational Infrastructure. And it forms this thing called an open data cube, and it's being used or considered by almost 40 countries. Just recently, they've released something called Digital Earth Africa, helping Africa also build an open data cube. And I'm just going to play you a very 40-second video clip here. This shows you the values. So this starting from about 1987. This is a picture of Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. I didn't have one for Melbourne. But the bit in the middle is the lake. But it shows you over this, they've made all this data sort of analysed and analysis ready. And it shows you here not only the droughts and the changing landscape, but how the city of Canberra is growing. So there it is growing on the left, out there to the west. And then hopefully you'll also see it growing up to the north. Oh, we missed it, but that's the start of some new developments. But this here took a lot of time, but it's now available in the Open Data Cube in Digital Earth Australia. Fantastic resource for academics, fantastic resource for our farmers, for our urban planners, who can access this open source information, not just for here in Australia, but now for Africa, to help with the availability. And really it's possible because the data is digital. In some of our countries in the region, I don't think it's Afghanistan, but I think it's one of the Stan countries, a lot of their data is not digitised, like their birth and death registers are still physical pieces of paper. So to be able to analyse things like mortality rates and where are our population, it's a very difficult task. So in conclusion, to me, the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals definitely increase the need for innovation. And we need to include sources of data and new methods to be able to do this. And everyone in our national statistical systems need to work together. For too long, we've thought of ourselves working as the National Statistics Office, the National Mapping Office, the National Science Office, the National Digital Office. But what we need to do is we need to work together across the statisticians like myself, the geospatial experts, the digital community, across our ministries, with the private sector and civil society, so that we can all work together to fill some of these data gaps, not just at the region, but globally. I'm actually an official statistician, so I come from a community that abides by a set of professional and ethics that talks about making sure that the data and the statistics that we provide come from solid scientific methods, codes of practice, they're transparent, you know what's going on. So I think keeping in mind that not all statistics are necessarily official statistics, and if you're definitely needing this for policy design, as we heard this morning, I would definitely encourage you to look at official statistics, not just data itself or statistics itself. And these fundamental principles of official statistics can help guide you with some of those framework of assurance. And then the United Nations, of which I'm part, and including United ESCAP, and there's several UN players here too, we are definitely very happy and very excited to be able to support you close the data gaps. So, Kap Kun Ka, thank you very much.
So I'm really interested in Digital Earth Australia. And my question has to do with the nature of the partnerships that were formed. I think you listed some of the partners. But from your perspective, what made those partnerships gel? How, if you will, I like to think about things like getting started guides. What are the first 3 steps, the first 5 steps that were necessary to get those partnerships organized to produce those amazing dashboards and the different products that are available now?
It would have been good if we had a Geoscience Australia person in the room. I can speak to you very broadly, but certainly from my experience with this topic here, is often you have to start with a champion who has an idea, who said, yeah, this is what we need. And in this case, in the terms of Digital Earth Australia, the satellite data that's available is not what's called analysis ready. It's dirty. Our land mass is moving towards the equator, so we don't actually have the same piece of the same XY coordinate of information at all times. So what somebody at Geoscience Australia, and there's got a big team there, was say that this data is really useful, but it takes us a long time to make it analysis ready. And then why do I have to have everybody else spending the same amount of time? And it's a very large, very, very, very large, and you need this national computing infrastructure that the Australian government invested in. So why don't we do all of this work and then make it available for others? So to me, this was a combination of a champion seeing the value of it. I think they probably piloted on a particular area. They might have piloted on Canberra so that they could use it as an example for a further investment, trialled it, and then made it ready. The partnership here was definitely between the Geosciences, CSIRO, the National Computational Facility. I think it's based at the Australian National University. So there's some of the things, to me, it was a good mindset of not only an individual but of an institution that said, well, we're doing this work. The data itself is a public good. I'm actually a public institution. I'm actually a public servant. Let's give it to the public. And now we're seeing the benefit of that, not just here in Australia, but also for a large developing continent of Africa.
Great.
Hey, good evening. My name is Govinda. I'm from India. I'm working in the Smart Cities project in India. So I have some question regarding the open data framework. We have been working on the open data framework there, but one of the many issues is that the boundaries of different departments are different. So a municipal corporation has a separate boundary and the police has a separate boundary. The data, there are multiple population numbers, there are multiple beneficiary numbers. How do we validate this and bring it to a common point? I mean, if somebody has to access this data and then they have to analyze and then act upon it, it becomes really difficult to trust which one is right and which one is wrong.
So the question was around open data, and in the interest of time, I didn't put this slide up. There is an institute, Open Data Watch, who do what's called the Open Data Inventory every year. I've put the 2 circles around Australia. This coverage and openness slide here talks about the 2018 results that talk about the openness of data in each of these countries and then the coverage. And this came from the National Statistical Offices. So in the first one on the left-hand side is the openness of data from Australia. I highlighted on the same slide New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand have a nice rivalry. I didn't highlight on here, you have Singapore have very open data. Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Hong Kong, part of administrative region of China. Open data, to me, has to come from a very top-down part of the system. So here in Australia, they adopted the Open Government Initiative, Open Government Partnership a few years ago, and put some focus on open government. Institutions, as part of a national statistics system, also look through an open data lens, tools like the Creative Commons. Given this is a governance type conference, I think the commitment to open data has to come through a governance lens, more not necessarily a government lens, because if you have the right governance in place, the institutions, the incentives, the mechanisms to do it, then you'll find parts of the governance structure, including government, will get on board. I think coming from a government background, they have a leadership role to play here, but also private sector, academics, the research sector also. It makes good business sense to have your data open.
Great, thank you for the question. And Elsa.
Good afternoon. My name is Elsa Esteves from National University of the South, Argentina. Thank you so much for a very insightful talk. I have two questions mainly. It's impressive the amount of targets that there is no data for them, yes? So I would like to know what are the current efforts in order to try to pursue getting this data. And second, if there are any guidelines or some recommendations about the quality for those targets for which there are data. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So this picture that I put up here for Asia and the Pacific, and if you go to the SDG Gateway, you can actually also look at for sub-regions in Asia and the Pacific, so you could look at it for Southeast Asia, for the Pacific. We don't provide it for countries, though, because the methodology requires setting targets, and it's a country-led agenda. What we've got to remember is that this is a development agenda absolutely for things like no poverty, quality education, and so on. But it's also a development agenda for developing means of implementation, such as data. So what I'm really excited about the agenda is that we have here a picture that says here's where we need to fill our gaps, rather than an agenda that says I'm just going to have an agenda based on the data that I've got available. So it looked holistically, and 193 countries came together and said, what is the development agenda I need? And then we said, what indicators are there to do with that? It wasn't driven by data availability, it was driven by the needs of the priorities. So what we see now is we see a bit of an industry, if you like. We see an industry, for each of these goals, they have what's called global data champions. So UNESCO, for instance, some colleagues here from UNESCO, or UNICEF, or the UN Environment Programme, they take a lead on some of these goals. So some of the environment goals, which are goal 13, 14 and 15, are mainly about environmental issues. We have a lot of data gaps there. You'll see a community being developed around the environment ones to say, well, how can we measure some of these? Similarly, around some of the peace, security and strong institutions, goal 16, the one from the bottom, there's also quite a lot of work going into how do we measure these. At the global level, there is, through the United Nations Statistical Commission, there is a global working group on big data. Many countries are part of that, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and they're trying to develop methods. They're trialling methods, and then they're trialling those methods, and then those methods can then get debated, and if they're picked up globally, they become a global standard, which then means you can then fill these. And so there is this cycle of identify where the gaps are, assign some custodians who can champion how to fill those, and then bring it to a high level, like a United Nations Statistical Commission that all countries are represented on, to say that this is a methodology for it. So to me, we have a development agenda not only for things like poverty, education, justice. We also have a development agenda for statisticians like myself, for data people, for ICT people. So it's a very inclusive development agenda. Mm-hmm.
I got to keep you guys guessing.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the two keynotes. I first wanted to make a number of observations that when we look at technology over the period of history and look at what continues and the lessons from technology compared to what people say it should be doing, is firstly, technology does not address social and political problems. It is a means to address those problems. And I think both of our two speakers spoke of those questions, that technology is an important part of the mix of social political arrangements, but it doesn't address it by itself. For example, just having an internet connection doesn't create democracy. The second thing is that I want to quote Donald Rumsfeld about the importance of data. The known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And I think this speaks to the two speakers as well, because we know what we know through data. In the SDGs, in terms of how do we use data, whether we actually use it for helping society or whether we use it for governing in different ways. And this is where also the level of trust versus the level of distrust with institutions, not only states, but also companies, come into place. And that also speaks to the question of the way in which we address power. So I think John spoke very well about the question about treating conflict. Do we deal with power in a way of conflict, or we do it in a way of diplomacy? And those are important considerations that we need to take forward at that international level that both speakers spoke to.
So
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll be making my remarks along the lens of what I see data offering both development and diplomacy. So I'm just trying to have a remark, a confusion that can maybe converge on those two things. So, but I'll proceed in three steps regarding what I will describe as data for development and data diplomacy. So, which is just a variation of the cyber, diplomacy, but focusing on data. There's an emerging field of data diplomacy now, which is just a sub part of the bigger discussion on cyber diplomacy. So, so my three steps will be first to elaborate a bit on what I see as affordances of data for both data development and diplomacy. The second will be to look at issues that I consider very important if we are going to realize some of the ideas that both John and Gemas have provided, and to also look at maybe what roles some entities can actually play internationally, can play in addressing some of those concerns. So in the first part, generally, even from what we've seen from Gema, there are at least three aspects I see data in with respect to development in terms of the development process. So the first would be in the area of planning and progress monitoring, which was highlighted very well. The second, which is very important, is actually also in the data serving as a mechanism for enabling participation of citizens and people in the development process. Empowerment, is a very important aspect of it. Participation is very key. Data serves as a very concrete mechanism in that context. And the third one is data as an economic resource, right? And I think also in Gemma's slide, I saw something like data as oil. So, so definitely those are three aspects that I see data interacting with development. In terms of diplomacy, which will be data diplomacy, will be the use of data in kind of the business of diplomacy, which is usually in the area of negotiation and agreements, essentially, linked to foreign policies of states. So there are at least 4 scenarios where we see data actually being very useful. So first is information gathering and diplomatic reporting. Second is the area of negotiation, public diplomacy as well as in terms of consular services. But all this for actually cross along looking at new sources of data, particularly social media data, big data, in carrying out all those various diplomatic functions. So, for instance, in terms of negotiation, increasingly we are seeing states actually looking at social media data, looking at open data as a way to frame their arguments and positions. We've also seen international cases where data from social media actually used in international law and courts. So these are actually emerging. Now, so going to the other side, which is the second question, which is what are the two issues I see in terms of being able to harness data in these two respects. So I see two aspects. The first aspect is the area of requisite capacity, and I think this is again has been reflected very clearly in both talks. First, in the issue of in the area of data gaps, and then the second is also very clear in John's presentation in terms of setting the appropriate structures to be able to enable states to actually put up the testing required for maybe for infrastructures. And the second will be how to mitigate the wrong use of data, all right, either in the context of development or in the context of diplomacy. In context of diplomacy, actually even worse. So development could be maybe in the area of misinformation, which we've seen, or wrong use of that. But in data diplomacy, we can actually look at the issue of conflicts. The wrong use actually lead to conflicts. Now, in terms of how I see some of these issues being addressed, I think regional entities actually could play a role. Regional economic communities particularly, to me, can play this role, play the role of providing or developing requisite capacities that member states actually need to be able to develop, data for development capability as well as data diplomacy. And interesting in the area of diplomacy, you actually find out that conflicts are actually regional. They start first in the regions. So if you look at all the conflicts in different parts of the world, it's usually within regions and communities. So having regional entities actually addressing these issues, to me, will be something that could actually, help in tackling both the capacity, as well as the misuse, issues. Okay, that's
Great, thank you very much. Do we have any questions for the panel from the audience? Sel.
Thank you. I'm Sel Maloli from University Laval in Canada. So my question is about the digital divide between countries. Since the framing the future technology with the insight from the past, so we need to use data, as you said, to analyze how people or how countries will reach the sustainable development goals. But technology is not deployed equally between the different countries. So my question is really open to the panel, so I don't have a specific person to whom I'm asking the question. But how telecom companies or how researchers or how the United Nations structure is dealing with this gap of technology to collect this data, to analyze it in order to transform our world? Thank you.
Who would like to take that first?
I'll start. Thank you very much for that question about the digital divide. I think the discussion that Gemma led is it adds a dimension that a lot of the Western discussions about digital divide has not really addressed, and that is the idea of a human right to a data identity. We take for granted in the West that we have an identity, we are known and we are counted, and governments are able to use that information to plan and provide services. In countries where we don't know that information, we actually can't provide those rights to education. We can't provide and plan for those rights to health. In a sense, there is a digital divide in the actual amount of data or lack of data about people. So I think that's an important dimension to the digital divide that really hasn't been explored very much. And that's where the SDG work is actually throwing that up to the people who study digital technology and data for the very first time to say, hang on, there's something more important there. Now, in terms of our histories of the changes of digital divide, we are aware that we do see divides occurring, but we also see an evolution of the collapsing of divides over time from access to different technologies, from collapsing from different age groups and gender. Now, that's not to say that we should be complacent in addressing those things, but we do see those digital divides over time reducing, and we should facilitate and increase that.
Great. Thank you very much. Gemma, did you want to go next here?
Yeah, so the 2030 agenda is actually quite amazing in a way, because it's got 193 countries signed up to this very ambitious agenda at the global level that has an annual reporting process. And this year there's going to be two, one at a high-level political forum in July and one at the General Assembly in September. And whatever you might think of the United Nations, bringing together 193 countries is a very powerful global mechanism. And in the Asia-Pacific region, yes, we're sitting in a very advanced country here, and we have very advanced countries in our region, but we also have some very poor countries in our region, Cambodia, Myanmar, countries that are at the start of their development journey. And from a statistics point of view, the phrase, we heard the phrase this morning, leapfrogging. We have a lot of countries in Asia-Pacific who can actually leapfrog countries like, I wouldn't want to be quoted as saying Australia, but we can leapfrog some of the national statistics systems that exist, because these countries have nothing and they're going to something. Whereas in an existing national statistical system like Australia or New Zealand, they have to go through a change process. And for those of you who go through change processes, you know those aren't particularly easy to go through. So for some countries, we're going from a nothing to a something, and from other countries, we're going through a change process. So the digital divide is a great opportunity for those countries who don't have any infrastructure at the moment, any digital literacy at the moment, to adopt the world, the best, the leading edge. And learn from the countries who have adopted that, what not to do or where to invest. So to me, obviously I'm an optimistic opportunity person here, and I think that the digital divide is an opportunity to do that. And I'd just secondly like to build on the comment here. From a statistical system point of view, you have to get your demographic information right, and then the economic information is just absolutely critical. And the challenge with this 169 targets or the 232 indicators is we don't want to put all of our development effort into the exciting areas where we can see geospatial information fixing some of these more cutting-edge areas of statistics. The fact that we've got a country like Afghanistan getting basic information of how many people are here from our geospatial information, how vital is that, not only for governments but for business, for civil society. And the World Bank has estimated that a properly functioning civil registration system, which is your births and deaths, contribute to 58 of these indicators. So if we invest not just in a basic human right like an identity, you're also investing in 58 of these indicators. So the multiplier effect is quite impressive. So I think the United Nations Development Agenda and the agenda that 193 countries have adopted, I look at it through very rosy glasses as a real opportunity to address some of these human rights issues, but also the data issues.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
Just a quick one. So if my memory serves me right, I think even goals 16 and 17, under those two, there are a number of indicators that actually directly address, I think under 16, institutional development, and possibly under 17, even capacity building for member states. So these are part of the process. Of course, we don't tend to emphasize those parts, and that's why I actually made my remark that I feel those are very critical. Coming from a developing country, I know primarily that without those states, it's so difficult to actually build on top of that. But they have to be targeted in line with the priorities of those member states. I think this one think we could look at in terms of moving forward, and some general capacity building, institutional building effort. They need to be targeted based on priorities. That's it.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions? You have a question there? Again, if you mind introducing yourself to the panel.
Yeah, it's Mark Gregory from RMIT University. I've got a question for the panel about cyber diplomacy. We've heard a lot about data, and we've heard a discussion on cyber diplomacy in relation to the relationship between business and government and between governments. But one of the things that's, in my particular area, a major problem, and I don't see the problem going away, is cybercrime and multinational, like international organisations that are essentially multinational cyber criminal organisations. I'd like the panel to sort of discuss how cyber diplomacy, especially in the sharing of data between countries and between organisations, might assist in the fight against cybercrime.
Great, thank you. Who'd like to jump in on that one?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Thanks, Teresa. I'll start because I'm probably the most naive on this, and the others can add a far more advanced perspective. You are right, and definitely when Gemma's presentation hit me, data can be power, so there's a great temptation by nations, individuals, companies to keep data, and then they're powerful, they have the knowledge. Everyone says that's not the best way to go, it's to open up and more data. Just a brief statistic, I think there's 10 billion connections, electronic connections at the moment. 5G's coming, there's estimated to be 100 billion connections, I think, by 2025. So there is going to be and because it's machine-to-machine connections. So there's going to be so much data, so much information out there, and this is what's frightening governments, of course, is there's going to be so much out there for cyber criminals to get hold of, etc., or to be manipulated by foreign actors, etc., etc. So having listened to Gemma's presentation and her 196 countries and data, it just struck me, how do you get people to be open with their data, not hide it, not pretend they don't have problems, or be afraid to put it out there if you're a country because you look like you're backward or you're not doing that well. And I think it has to be through these global or regional frameworks. I think you've got to build confidence at the regional level perhaps first, then in the UN level. And we really need to get moving in international and regional circles to open up this dialogue and build confidence building measures, a term from conflict days, but we need those now in cyber security because the security of data in the future is important against cyber criminals, as you say, Mark, and they could be in Iceland, but they'll pretend they're from China, or in China pretending they're from the US, so you won't really know where they're coming from. So we've got to provide that security, but at the other hand, we want open data for all the benefits that have been perfectly described by the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
I think, generally speaking, I think it's difficult to talk about cyber diplomacy without considering the overarching diplomatic framework that's also in place. So it's just like the remark that I was made earlier on that say any issue regarding the use of data within diplomatic framework or cybersecurity must follow the existing, diplomatic arrangement, foreign policy of government. So the relationship between the states themselves will actually guide whether they're going to share data and the kinds of arrangement that's going to happen. So I feel that context is very important in the discussion. If we remove that, we're going to have a lot of complexity and chaos. But the way it works in reality is that cyber diplomacy is still diplomacy. So, so that context, I think, may provide some guiding light in terms of how it will work, in terms of sharing data or in terms of collaborations for mutual, maybe deterrence or whatever. So,
Paul, the final word?
I guess the question about cyber diplomacy is a very interesting one because it brings to the fore something that's often regarded in international discussions of data, that isn't a public discussion. And a lot of those questions that are occurring at intelligence level or international policing level, the promise or the opportunities for a cyber diplomacy brings to the surface, just like, for example, free trade deals or agreements around environment, that brings the opportunity to be more open and sharing and saying, this is what we're trying to do collaboratively rather than doing it subterraneanly. And I think there is a benefit in doing that rather than just treating it in terms of national security issues.
Yeah, so the 2030 agenda is actually quite amazing in a way, because it's got 193 countries signed up to this very ambitious agenda at the global level that has an annual reporting process. And this year there's going to be two, one at a high-level political forum in July and one at the General Assembly in September. And whatever you might think of the United Nations, bringing together 193 countries is a very powerful global mechanism. And in the Asia-Pacific region, yes, we're sitting in a very advanced country here, and we have very advanced countries in our region, but we also have some very poor countries in our region, Cambodia, Myanmar, countries that are at the start of their development journey. And from a statistics point of view, the phrase, we heard the phrase this morning, leapfrogging. We have a lot of countries in Asia Pacific who can actually leapfrog countries like, I wouldn't want to be quoted as saying Australia, but we can leapfrog some of the national statistics systems that exist, because these countries have nothing and they're going to something. Whereas in an existing national statistical system like Australia or New Zealand, they have to go through a change process. And for those of you who go through change processes, you know those aren't particularly easy to go through. So for some countries, we're going from a nothing to a something, and from other countries, we're going through a change process. So the digital divide is a great opportunity for those countries who don't have any infrastructure at the moment, any digital literacy at the moment, to adopt the world, the best, the leading edge. And learn from the countries who have adopted that, what not to do or where to invest. So to me, obviously I'm an optimistic opportunity person here, and I think that the digital divide is an opportunity to do that. And I'd just secondly like to build on the comment here. From a statistical system point of view, you have to get your demographic information right, and then the economic information is just absolutely critical. And the challenge with this 169 targets or the 232 indicators is we don't want to put all of our development effort into the exciting areas where we can see geospatial information fixing some of these more cutting-edge areas of statistics. The fact that we've got a country like Afghanistan getting basic information of how many people are here from our geospatial information, how vital is that, not only for governments but for business, for civil society? And the World Bank has estimated that a properly functioning civil registration system, which is your births and deaths, contribute to 58 of these indicators. So if we invest not just in a basic human right like an identity, you're also investing in 58 of these indicators. So the multiplier effect is quite impressive. So I think the United Nations Development Agenda and the agenda that 193 countries have adopted, I look at it through very rosy glasses as a real opportunity to address some of these human rights issues, but also the data issues.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
Just a quick one. So if my memory serves me right, I think even goals 16 and 17, under those two, there are a number of indicators actually directly address, I think under 16, institutional development, and possibly under 17, even capacity building for member states. So these are part of the process. Of course, we don't tend to emphasize those parts, and that's why I actually made my remark that I feel those are very critical. Coming from a developing country, I know primarily that without those states, it's so difficult to actually build on top of that. But they have to be targeted in line with the priorities of those member states. I think this maybe this one thing we could look at in terms of moving forward, and some general capacity building, institutional building effort. They need to be targeted based on priorities. That's it.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions? You have a question there? Again, if you mind introducing yourself to the panel.
Yeah, it's Mark Gregory from RMIT University. I've got a question for the panel about cyber diplomacy. We've heard a lot about data, and we've heard a discussion on cyber diplomacy in relation to the relationship between business and government and between governments. But one of the things that's, in my particular area, a major problem, and I don't see the problem going away, is cybercrime and multinational, like international organisations that are essentially multinational cyber criminal organisations. I'd like the panel to sort of discuss how cyber diplomacy, especially in the sharing of data between countries and between organisations, might assist in the fight against cybercrime.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Thanks, Teresa. I'll start because I'm probably the most naive on this, and the others can add a far more advanced perspective. You are right, and definitely when Gemma's presentation hit me, data can be power, so there's a great temptation by nations, individuals, companies to keep data, and then they're powerful, they have the knowledge. Everyone says that's not the best way to go, it's to open up and more data. Just a brief statistic, I think there's 10 billion connections, electronic connections at the moment. 5G's coming, there's estimated to be 100 billion connections, I think, by 2025. So there is going to be because it's machine-to-machine connections. So there's going to be so much data, so much information out there, and this is what's frightening governments, of course, is there's going to be so much out there for cyber criminals to get hold of, etc., or to be manipulated by foreign actors, etc., etc. So having listened to Gemma's presentation and her 196 countries and data, it just struck me, how do you get people to be open with their data, not hide it, not pretend they don't have problems, or be afraid to put it out there if you're a country because you look like you're backward or you're not doing that well. And I think it has to be through these global or regional frameworks. I mean, you've got to build confidence at the regional level perhaps first, then in the UN level. And we really need to get moving in international and regional circles to open up this dialogue and build confidence building measures, a term from conflict days, but we need those now in cyber security because the security of data in the future is important against cyber criminals, as you say, Mark, and they could be in Iceland, but they'll pretend they're from China, or in China pretending they're from the US, so you won't really know where they're coming from. So we've got to provide that security, but at the other hand, we want open data for all the benefits that have been perfectly described by the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
I think, generally speaking, I think it's difficult to talk about cyber diplomacy without considering the overarching diplomatic framework that's also in place. So it's just like the remark that was made earlier on that say any issue regarding the use of data within diplomatic framework or cybersecurity must follow the existing, diplomatic arrangement, foreign policy of government. So the relationship between the states themselves would actually guide whether they're going to share data and the kinds of arrangement that's going to happen. So I feel that context is very important in the discussion. If we remove that, we're going to have a lot of complexity and chaos. But the way it works in reality is that cyber diplomacy is still diplomacy. So, so that context, I think, may provide some guiding light in terms of how it will work, in terms of sharing data or in terms of collaborations for mutual, maybe deterrence or whatever. So,
Paul, the final word?
I guess the question about cyber diplomacy is a very interesting one because it brings to the fore something that's often regarded in international discussions that of technical, of data, that isn't a public discussion. And a lot of those questions that are occurring at intelligence level or international policing level, the promise or the opportunities for a cyber diplomacy brings to the surface, just like, for example, free trade deals or agreements around environment, that brings the opportunity to be more open and sharing and saying, this is what we're trying to do collaboratively rather than doing it subterraneanly. And I think there is a benefit in doing that rather than just treating it in terms of national security issues.